5. My Amish wife hid her pain from me for 9 months. I learned why after our child was born. There's a brown glass bottle sitting on the shelf above our kitchen sink right now. The label peeled off years ago. What's inside smells like wet earth and something sharp, like the first bite of a root you shouldn't chew but your grandmother told you to anyway. Red raspberry leaf. Dried nettles. A little bit of cramp bark my wife ground down herself with the old marble mortar that belonged to her Mam's mam. I didn't know that bottle existed for 9 months. 9 months. Rebecca made it every morning before I came in from milking. I'd find the kitchen warm and the kettle still ticking on the stove, but I never saw what she poured. I never asked. That's the thing about our people. A woman carries a child, and we act like it isn't happening. We don't say the word. We don't look at the belly. We keep working. And she kept working. Splitting kindling in her 7th month, hanging wash when her back was so bad she'd grip the clothesline post with both hands and just breathe. I watched her do that once from the barn door. Her knuckles were white and her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. I thought she was praying. She wasn't praying. She was counting through the pain. I was 26 years old, and I didn't know my own wife was suffering. I didn't know what that bottle was for. And I didn't know that the remedy she was hiding from me was the only thing keeping her on her feet. Quick pause. My name is Joseph, and this is Rebecca's husband. If these stories stay with you, if they remind you of something the old ones knew, subscribe. It's free, and it's the reason I can keep telling them. Tell me in the comments, was there ever a remedy someone in your family made in secret, something you only found out about after it was too late or too far gone? And if you want to go further, a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me these old ways are worth remembering. That keeps this going. Now, back to what happened. Rebecca and I married in November. That's when most Amish weddings happen, after harvest, before the ground freezes hard. Her father's farm was in the valley south of ours, and I'd known her since we were scholars together, back when she used to sit 3 benches ahead of me at Sunday meeting, and I'd stare at the back of her cap and forget the words to the hymn. We were both 25 when we married, old by our standards, but Rebecca had stayed home to care for her mam through a long sickness, a stomach ailment that no English doctor could name, but that her grandmother treated with peppermint oil and chamomile compresses and a tea so bitter Rebecca said it turned your tongue gray. Her mam lived another 11 years. That's the thing I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. Rebecca didn't just grow up around remedies, she grew up inside them. Her grandmother, we called her Grossmother Leah, kept a garden behind the Doughty house with 40-some plants I couldn't name if you paid me. Comfrey, yarrow, valerian, things with roots that looked like old fingers. Rebecca knew what every one of them did before she turned 12. I knew how to shoe a horse and split oak. I didn't know what cramp bark was. I didn't know red raspberry leaf could do what it does. And nobody in my family thought a man needed to know. That was the rule, and it wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't in the ordnung. It wasn't something the bishop preached about. It was just the way the air moved in a room. Women handled the body. Men handled the land. If your wife was with child, you didn't talk about it. Not to your brother. Not to your neighbor at the wood shop. Not even really to her, unless she brought it up first, and she almost never did. I remember my dad, he had 7 children, and I once asked Mam how she managed carrying my youngest brother Eli while canning all those tomatoes in August. She looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't recognize, just blinked. Then went back to sealing the jars. I was maybe 14. I didn't ask again. You learn that silence isn't cruelty. It's just the wall everybody agreed to stand behind. And I stood behind it too, for years, without knowing what it cost. Rebecca found out she was expecting in early March. I know that now. I didn't know it then. What I knew was that she started rising earlier, 4:15, 4:20, and by the time I came in from the barn at 5:30, the kitchen smelled like something herbal and dark, not coffee, something rooted, almost like the smell of the cellar in high summer when Mam used to dry burdock down there and the air got thick and green. I'd see the kettle on the stove, the cup already washed and put back in the cabinet, the counter wiped clean. Rebecca standing at the window, her hand flat on the small of her back. She'd smile when I came in. I never once thought to ask what she'd been drinking. She was my wife. She smiled. That was enough. I didn't know it wasn't enough. I didn't know she'd been up since 3:45 some mornings, steeping nettles in a pot she kept under the sink, measuring cramp bark powder with a tin spoon that had belonged to Grossmutter Leah. She did this alone, in the dark, by the light of one kerosene lamp turned low so it wouldn't wake me. The months went on. Rebecca wore the loose coat every Amish woman does when she's carrying, and we all know what it means, but we pretend we don't. I noticed the coat around May, maybe late April. I remember because the lilacs along the fence had just opened, and the whole south side of the house smelled sweet, and she was standing near them with that dark coat buttoned up, and I thought, but I didn't say it. I didn't say anything, and she didn't either. We just kept moving through the days like two horses pulling the same plow in different furrows. She weeded the garden on her knees. She carried water from the pump. I watched her wince once when she stood up too fast from the bench at supper, but she covered it by reaching for the salt, like that's what the movement was. I believed her. No, I let myself believe her. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to learn what that difference costs. By July, Rebecca was far enough along that the midwife, Hannah Stoltzfus, a quiet woman with hands like bread dough, soft but strong, had started coming by on Tuesday afternoons. I'd see her buggy in the lane, and I'd find something to do in the far field. That was expected. The midwife's visit was women's country. But one Tuesday I came back early because the draw knife I needed was in the shed behind the kitchen, and I heard them through the open window, Hannah's voice, low and steady. And Rebecca, give me a second, Rebecca was crying, not loud, the kind of crying that sounds like breathing with something caught in it. I stood outside that window with the draw knife in my hand, and I heard Hannah say, "How long has the pain been like this?" And Rebecca said, "Since the beginning. Since the beginning. 5 months." She'd been in pain for 5 months, and I didn't know, or I knew, and I let the silence cover it. I stood there on the hard-packed dirt, and my boots felt like they were nailed to the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't go in. A husband doesn't walk into that room. So I walked back to the field, and I didn't say a word that night. Not one word. We sat at the table and ate bean soup and bread, and I watched her hands shake when she lifted the spoon, and I said nothing, because that's what I'd been taught nothing looked like. The baby came in early December. First real cold snap. The water in the trough had a skin of ice on it by 5 in the morning, and the barn cats were all piled together in the hay like one animal. Hannah arrived before dawn. Rebecca's sister Mary came too, and her ma'am, who was frail by then but still moved through a birthing room like she was 20 years younger. I stayed in the front room. I could hear everything through the wall, the floorboards creaking, the low murmur of women's voices, and then, later, sounds I won't describe because they aren't mine to tell. But there was a moment, I think it was near the end, when Rebecca screamed, just once, and then silence, and then the baby cried, and I put my face in my hands and I sat there on the bench by the cold stove, and I don't know what to call what I did. It wasn't crying, it was something lower than crying, something in the chest that doesn't have a name. They let me in after. The room smelled like iron and lavender. Hannah always brought lavender oil, rubbed it on the mother's wrists after delivery. Rebecca was lying on the bed, pale as the sheet under her, holding our son. He was so small, so red. His fingers were curled up like fern heads in spring. And Rebecca looked at me and she said, and I'll never forget this, she said, "There's a bottle under the kitchen sink. I need you to bring it to me." I went. I found the bottle. Brown glass, no label, half full of something dark. I brought it to her, and she drank a long sip straight from the bottle and closed her eyes. Hannah watched and nodded, like she knew, like she'd always known. I said, "What is that?" And Rebecca opened her eyes and looked at me, and she said, "It's what kept me standing, Joseph." That's when I learned. Not all at once. Rebecca was too tired that night to explain much, and I didn't push. But over the next days and weeks, as she healed and nursed our boy, it came out in pieces. The pain had started almost immediately, a deep pulling ache in her hips and lower back that got worse every week. Some days it radiated down her legs so badly she couldn't feel her feet by evening. She didn't tell me because, and this is the part that still sits in my chest like a stone, she didn't think she was supposed to. Her ma'am had carried 7 babies and never spoken of pain. Her grandmother carried 9. In our world, pregnancy wasn't a sickness, it was just life. You didn't complain about life. You endured it, and you thanked God for the child, and you kept your tea a secret, because even the remedy was an admission of weakness. Rebecca wasn't hiding from me. She was hiding from the shame of needing help at all. The bottle was her own recipe, built from what grossmother Leah had taught her. Red raspberry leaf for the uterus. It tones the muscles, her grandmother had said, makes them ready. Dried nettles for the iron, because Rebecca bruised like a peach that whole pregnancy, and she knew her blood was thin. Cramp bark, and this is the one that mattered most, for the spasms in her back that came every night like clockwork around 8 o'clock. She'd wait until I went to bed, then sit in the kitchen chair and press a hot cloth against her spine and drink that dark tea and count her breaths until the bark took hold. She did this for months, alone, in a house where I was sleeping 30 feet away. And the thing I learned later, the thing that could have changed everything, was that a simple comfrey compress, applied to the lower back twice a day, might have cut that pain in half. Hannah knew it. Her ma'am probably knew it. But nobody told me, because the system wasn't built for the husband to know. And Rebecca, I'm not angry at her. I need you to hear that. She did what every woman in her line had done. She suffered quietly, and she healed herself with what the garden gave her, and she didn't ask for help because asking was the one thing nobody had ever shown her how to do. After our son was born, we named him Levi, after Rebecca's grandfather, I started watching differently. Not just Rebecca, every woman around me. At church meals, at barn raisings, at the sisters' tables where the women sat together and passed the bread and the chow-chow, and never once mentioned what their bodies were doing. I started noticing things I'd been blind to for 26 years. My sister-in-law Martha, who was carrying her 4th that winter, the way she pressed her knuckles into the bench when she stood up, then smoothed her apron like nothing happened. My neighbor's wife Ada, who I saw once through her kitchen window leaning over the sink, with both hands flat on the counter, just breathing. I'd see these things now, and my jaw would go tight, and I'd think about that brown bottle under my sink, and I'd wonder how many other bottles were hidden in how many other kitchens. I thought about saying something to my brother Amos once. We were sharpening blades in the shop, and he was talking about Martha being tired, and I almost said, "Do you know what she's drinking in the mornings?" But I didn't, because a man doesn't say that. Not in our world. So I just kept running the stone along the edge and listened to the blade sing against the grit. That became my habit. Watching, saying nothing, carrying it in the back of my teeth like a piece of gravel I couldn't spit out. The spring after Levi was born, I did something I'd never done before. I went into Rebecca's garden. Not the vegetable garden. I'd been in that one 1,000 times, pulling weeds, staking tomatoes. I mean the other garden, the one behind the Doughty house that had been Grossmother Leah's. Rebecca had taken it over after the old woman passed. It was maybe 15 by 20 feet, bordered with fieldstone, and it looked like chaos if you didn't know what you were seeing. But I started asking. I'd point at a plant and say, "What's that one?" And Rebecca would tell me, quietly at first, like she wasn't sure I really wanted to know. "That's comfrey, for the bones, for swelling. That's red clover. Ma'am used it for the skin. That one, don't touch it with your bare hand first thing in the morning. That's stinging nettle. But you dry it and it's good for the blood." I remember she showed me the cramp bark. It was a small shrub, really, tucked in the corner near the stone wall, and the bark was grayish and peeled in strips. She pulled a piece off and held it under my nose. It smelled like nothing I can describe right. Woody, but with something underneath. Almost like, wait, no, like the smell of wet aspirin, if that makes sense. Bitter and sharp but clean. She said Grossmother Leah used to say, "That bark has carried more babies into this world than any doctor in Lancaster County." I think about that line a lot. That same spring, I talked to old Eli Zook. He was, I'm trying to get his age right, 74. No, 76. He lived down the road, and he was what some people quietly called a brocher, though he never used that word himself. He'd say he tried for people. That's the old way of putting it. If your cow was sick, you called Eli before you called the vet. If a child had a fever that wouldn't break, Eli came to the house and he'd move his lips without making a sound and press his thumb to the child's forehead in a way that looked like nothing but that people swore worked. I'd known Eli my whole life, but I'd never actually sat down and talked to him about what he did. That spring I did. I walked over on a Saturday afternoon and found him on his porch oiling a harness. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He said, "You've got questions now." Not a question, a statement. Like he'd been waiting. I told him about Rebecca, about the bottle, about the 9 months of silence. He listened without moving. When I finished, he said something that rearranged the furniture in my head. He said, "The women have always known more than us. Our job isn't to learn what they know. Our job is to stop pretending they aren't carrying it." Then he spit off the porch and went back to oiling the harness. That was Eli. He'd give you one sentence that would take you 5 years to unpack, and then he'd go back to his work like he'd said nothing at all. I carried what Eli said. I carried it into the barn and into the field and into the nights when Levi would cry and Rebecca would rise and I'd hear her bare feet on the kitchen floor. I started doing something small. I don't even know if she noticed at first. Every morning I'd get up before her, not by much, maybe 10 minutes, and I'd put the kettle on. Just that. I didn't know what to steep. I didn't know the measurements, but I'd have the water hot and the cup out and the little jar of dried nettles open on the counter. So when she came down, she didn't have to do it in the dark anymore. She didn't have to hide it. The first morning she saw it, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the counter and then looked at me, and I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded, and I nodded, and that was more than I'd ever said with my mouth. That's what the old ones knew. The remedy isn't always the plant. Sometimes the remedy is just letting someone take it in the light. 4 winters later, we had our 3rd child, a girl, and this time was different. Rebecca told me the day she knew. We were sitting on the porch after supper, and she said it plain, like she was telling me the weather. I said, "What do you need?" She looked at me like nobody had ever asked her that before. Maybe nobody had. She told me she needed the cramp bark tea starting in the 2nd month. She needed the nettle infusion daily for the iron. She needed a comfrey poultice for her back on the bad nights. The recipe was 2 parts dried comfrey root to 1 part warm water, mixed into a paste and spread on a cotton cloth and laid across the lower back for 20 minutes. She said it like she was reading from a list she'd kept in her head for years, waiting for somebody to ask. I wrote it down on a piece of brown paper with a pencil stub. I still have that paper. It's in the drawer under the lamp in the front room, and the pencil marks are faded now, but I can still read every word. By the time I was 30, I knew things no man in my family had ever known. Not because I was smarter, because I asked, because Rebecca answered, because Grossmutter Leah's garden kept growing even after she was gone, and because Eli Zook told me the truth on a Saturday afternoon while oiling a harness. I knew that red raspberry leaf wasn't just a tea. It was a generations-old preparation for labor, something the women in Rebecca's family had taken for at least 100 years. I knew that nettles pulled iron into the blood in a way that the English pills didn't, or at least that's what Rebecca believed, and I believed her, because she'd watched it work in her own mother's body. I knew that cramp bark, viburnum opulus, Rebecca called it once, and I said, "What language is that?" And she laughed. The only time she ever laughed at me about the remedies. I knew it could quiet a spasm in the back or the belly better than anything the English pharmacy had on its shelf, and I knew that comfrey, the plant with the rough, hairy leaves that Grossmutter Leah called knitbone, could bring down a swelling or soothe a bruise overnight. I knew these things because a woman trusted me enough to stop hiding them. And I still grieve, for the boy I was at 26, who didn't know to ask. I tried to explain this once to an Englishman, a fellow who came to buy a harness and stayed for coffee and started asking about the herbs in the garden. I told him about the cramp bark, about the nettles, about what Rebecca had carried alone for 9 months. He listened, And then he said, "But didn't she want to go to a real doctor?" And I just looked at him. I didn't know where to start. The garden was the doctor. The brown bottle under the sink was the prescription. The women who came before Rebecca were the medical school. He didn't understand, and I don't blame him. You can't explain 100 years of knowledge to someone who thinks healing started with a white coat. There are 3 things this life gave me that I'll carry until they put me in the ground. The first is the smell of Grossmutter Leah's garden in late June. Comfrey blooming, yarrow just starting, the nettles tall enough to brush your forearm if you walk the path too fast, and the whole plot buzzing with bees so fat they looked like they'd been stitched out of velvet. The second is the sound of Rebecca's voice, the first time she told me a remedy out loud, not in a whisper, not in secret, but sitting at our own kitchen table in the full light of a Tuesday morning, like it was hers to say, because it was. The third is the weight of my son in my arms that December night, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, smelling like lavender oil and new skin, and knowing that a brown glass bottle with no label and a recipe that was older than anyone alive in our church had carried him safely into the world. That's what the old ones knew. The land and the body are the same garden. You tend them both, or you lose them both. If you grew up somewhere, the women in your family healed in secret, counting drops by lamplight, steeping roots before dawn, carrying pain so quietly you didn't even know it was there. I see you. If you're the husband who didn't ask, not because you didn't care, but because nobody ever told you that asking was allowed, I see you. If you're the woman who hid the bottle, who measured the bark, who did it alone because that's how your mother did it, and her mother before her, I see you. If you lost a remedy when you lost a grandmother, and now there's a plant in the garden you can't name, and a gap in your memory that aches like a missing tooth, I see you. If you're English and something in this story pulled at you, something old, something you can't explain but you felt in your chest, I see you too. Wherever you are in this, I see you. And you are not alone. Tell me in the comments, what's the remedy your family carried? What did your grandmother make that nobody wrote down? I want to hear it. Write it here so it doesn't disappear. And there is so much more I haven't said yet. There are remedies I haven't been ready to share, but I'm getting closer. If you want to walk this road with me, subscribe to Rebecca's husband. That's why this channel exists, so the old ways have a place to live out loud. And if a super chat or a membership feels right to you, that's you saying these stories matter, and that's enough to keep me telling them. The healing was never in the hiding, it was always in the telling.